Hi, I'm having a bit of a lazy day, and actually the subject of this video is not something I was planning to talk about. I was going to make a video on COVID, but there'll be plenty of time for that. I want to make a video about a bit of a totally unrelated subject, but one that's worth commenting on a little bit. Just been browsing the internet and I came across I think it was on some actor's credit for film they've been or something like that. I came across the Leo Frank case, which occurred in Georgia, the American state of Georgia, not the country, in 1915, 1913 to 1915. I'd been familiar with this case before because I've done a bit of research on the history of lynchings in America. And it's worth talking about this a little bit because I think it taps a lot into attitudes because there are still people today, believe it or not, who defend lynching. Um, One thing that's important to remember is looking at this case, and I'll put a link to it. Um, an innocent young girl was brutally murdered, and when we look at lynching cases, we have to also remember that there are crimes behind that, and the victims of those crimes shouldn't be forgotten. Um, Now, I don't want to go into extensive details about the case itself, but just to broadly lay it out, Leo Frank was a young Jewish man, 31, working in a pencil factory in the deep south in Georgia at turn of the century, 1913. And a young girl, 13 years old, by the name of Mary Fagan, who worked in that pencil factory, was found dead. And because of the time and because of the suit, she was found on the factory floor by a janitor. It was actually initially thought that she was black because the lighting and so on. She was actually white. But that's significant because often in the Deep South, lynchings were very much influenced and inflamed when the victims were white females. There's no getting away from that. Um, they were perceived to be angelic and sort of the white man's virtue. Of course, in this case, we're talking about a little girl, but that was always an inflammatory situation. Now, what's a little bit unusual about this case is that there was a black man who was also a suspect, and the majority of lynching victims in the South were black. In other regions in the West, most lynching victims were either white, Hispanic, or Chinese. But it's the South where the majority of victims were black. And nationwide, I think the majority were black as well as a total as total figures added up. I think the total figure of people lynched in the United States from the this is very approximate, but from the 1860s to the 1930s was around 4,000 people, and that's not an exact figure. That's an approximate, um, probably a good deal more. But in the South, the majority of victims were black. So what's unusual in this case is that public opinion actually favoured the black man in this case. And I think there was a number of reasons for that. Unquestionably, there was anti-Semitism at play. Leo Frank did seem to be a bit of a dubious character. Um, but where the controversy arose was that he was acquitted. Now, I want to be very clear. I don't know if he was guilty or not. I haven't studied the case extensively enough to say that either way. But quite honestly, when it comes to the issue of lynching, that doesn't matter. I take the view if he was guilty of the crime, he should have either served the rest of his life in prison or been judicially executed. I'm against the death penalty, but I could accept that for, you don't get much worse than murdering a young girl and raping her as well. But with lynching, it's extrajudicial justice. In that case, there was a lot of senior officials involved, including a judge, including even electricians, people who had planned this in advance. called themselves the Knights of Mary Fagan, and it all came from the governor's decision to commute his sentence. And it's a very troubling case. He was abused after the lynching. His face was stood on. There aren't any photos of the post-lynching. There is a photo of him hanging from the noose and some of these so-called knights standing around. Sickening, absolutely sickening. I've also seen photos of black lynchings. One that always made my stomach turn was a 17-year-old black kid, really, called Jesse Washington, who was lynched in Waco, Texas in 1916. Important to understand that, um, that people were brutalized by this. It was made into public entertainment. Um, and what differs from later lynchings, so for example, the Emmett Till case is often brought up, but the difference with that is that with the Emmett Till case, it was Klansmen who abducted him. It wasn't really a public event in the same way. Still awful, but to me, the most sickening lynchings were those at the very start of the century, from roughly 1890 to about 1920. Most were in the south. There were a few in the north. Duluth in Minnesota had a particularly notorious lynching. Um, but if you look at those photos, they were truly sickening, and it was the desensitization. There was even one in California in the early 30s, which of two white guys. That's just to show it wasn't just black men who were linked up to misconception. In that case, they were accused of murdering a young millionaire heir. I forget the name of the case now, but there's a photo of that which is haunting. This is about 1933, I think it was. And you can see people in the crowd, men and women, just treating it like a public holiday. These two guys who were lynched, stripped naked. And America really, really does need to accept that this is something that happened well into the 20th century. Today we look at some savage things that happen in conflicts in developing countries. We see brutality in Africa, and there is, you take any African conflict, there's extreme cruelty and savagery. Um, and in developed Western countries, we look down on it. But the truth of the matter is, the United States does have a very dark past when it comes to this stuff. And what I find disturbing is, even today, there are people who defend it. Now, here's the thing. Let's say Leo Frank was guilty. Um, the point is, this was extrajudicial justice. It was extreme vigilantism, and that can never be acceptable. If he was guilty, he should have spent the rest of his days in prison or been hanged judicially, legally, through the system. If there was genuine belief that he was guilty rather than just anti-Semitic prejudice, which I believe there was, having looked somewhat at the case, if there was a belief he was genuinely guilty, there could have been a retrial. The prosecution could have pushed for that. But to drag a man from a cell and lynch him from a tree, it is barbaric. And I find it troubling that people, even today, not just in this case, but in other cases, defend lynching today, in 2021. Um, I don't think it's just racism. I think that's an issue, racism and anti-Semitism. But I think it's also a primitive mindset that thinks that that sort of vigilante justice is okay. I mean, there's a human side to this. If I was a parent and my child was murdered, I'd want the blood of the person who done it, no question about it. But the thing about these lynchings was they were like community events. Um, and there are few things in this world more scary than a rampaging mob. It's a very frightening thing because there is a deficit of rational thinking. Guilt and innocence doesn't matter. We need to kill the Jew for, hurting this girl, and we believe he's guilty, but we don't know for a fact. Um, There's something deeply, deeply troubling about that. Bear in mind, anti-Semitism was rife at the start of the last century. France had just come out of the Dreyfus affair. There was another case in Tsarist Russia, the Belis affair, I think it was, in Ukraine. Um, but the Leo Frank case is just one of many. It's high profile because of the white Jewish man in the Deep South. Um, there was racial components to it because the black defendant was kind of portrayed as there was actually ironically a racist defense of him insofar as a black guy couldn't have been sophisticated enough to work up a complex defense story. That was one of the reasons he, you know, he wasn't found guilty. But as per the Wikipedia article, most academics today who've looked at the case believe that actually it was the black suspect who was most likelihood guilty. We'll never know for sure. Um, but this is not about being a liberal on crime. I'm pretty conservative on crime, but I think that's a testament to human nature. And although this is the past and it's now getting further in the past, we're not totally away from that today. Even in this country, we've had vigilante justice. We've had sort of cases whereby people have been accused of something, and it's particularly hot button issues. Anything to do with children is always going to be inflammatory. Rape to a lesser extent, but especially with children, it's the sort of thing that, and the tabloids, to their shame, have sometimes stoked the flames without being responsible. Case in the UK, young schoolgirl Sarah Payne was murdered in 2000. And I remember that time, I'm old enough to remember that there was people basically forming lynch mobs, hounding out so-called nonces as they saw it. Those people may or may not have been sexual offenders, but mob mentality can never be condoned because it's based on rumors, it's based on extrajudicial justice without evidence, without strong evidence. I will say this though, I think vigilante justice happens when there's a perception that the law is too soft or that genuinely guilty people get off, and that's something that definitely needs to be addressed. But I think that society needs to really, really think carefully before defending that sort of thing. And I find it troubling that there's people now, 105 years later, actually saying he got what he deserved. Because A, they don't know for a fact that he was guilty, and B, even if he was, the fact that they'd be okay with an extrajudicial lynching is troubling, very troubling.